Episode 2, Fortress Mountains. Climb with me. The path is steep, winding through birch and pine, over roots that have broken through the thin soil to grip the bedrock beneath. Your boots find purchase on granite worn smooth by 10,000 years of weather and the passage of countless feet, deer, elk, bear, and human. The forest closes around you, dense and cathedral quiet, but ahead you can sense a change in the light, a thinning of the canopy. You are approaching the summit. Break through the last screen of trees and the world opens. You stand on a hill that rises abruptly from the surrounding landscape, not quite a mountain, but more than a simple elevation. From here, Lake Ladoga spreads before you in all its vast gray-blue immensity, dotted with islands like pieces of a scattered puzzle. Behind you, forests roll away to distant hills. To your left and right, the land drops steeply. This hilltop is a natural fortress, approachable from only one direction, commanding views in all others. And beneath your feet, if you look carefully, you can see them, stones. Not natural outcroppings, though they blend so seamlessly with the landscape that you might think so at first. These are placed stones, arranged stones, stones that have been moved and positioned with deliberate intent. In places, they still form recognizable lines, walls, though time and frost and the patient work of tree roots have scattered many of the blocks. Some of these stones are massive, cubic boulders that would require 10 men with levers to move. Others are smaller, filling gaps, creating a barrier that once stood taller than a man. This is a linnavuoret, a fortress mountain. One of dozens that crown the hills around Lake Ladoga, silent sentinels watching over a landscape that has seen more war than peace, built by hands whose identity is lost to everything but speculation and legend. This is where we stand today. This is the story of the stones that remember everything. The strategic heart of the North. To understand why these fortresses exist, you must understand Lake Ladoga's unique position in Northern European geography and history. Ladoga is not just large, it is the largest lake in Europe, covering nearly 7,000 square miles. But its significance goes far beyond size. The lake sits at a crucial junction of waterways. Rivers flow into it from the south and east, connecting it to the Volga Basin and ultimately to the Caspian Sea and the trade routes to Byzantium and the Islamic world. The Neva River flows out of it to the west, providing access to the Baltic Sea and the trading networks of Northern Europe. For medieval traders, Ladoga was a highway. Furs from the northern forests, amber from the Baltic, silver from Arabic coins, Byzantine silks, all these goods passed through or near Ladoga as merchants transported them between markets. Control the lake and its shores, and you controlled enormously lucrative trade routes. But waterways that facilitate trade also facilitate invasion. The Lake Ladoga region sat at the contested frontier between multiple powers and peoples. To the west, Swedish and later Russian forces from Novgorod vied for dominance. To the east and north, various Finnic and Sami peoples had their own claims and interests. No border here was ever stable for long. Every generation seemed to bring new conflicts, new raids, new armies marching or sailing through. In such an environment, defensible positions were not luxuries, they were necessities for survival. The linnavuoret served this need. A community could not defend an entire region, but they could defend a single fortified hilltop. When raiders came, whether Viking Age Norse, medieval Swedes, Russian forces, or simply bandits and rival villages, the people would retreat to their fortress mountain, bringing their most precious possessions and livestock. The attackers could burn the villages below, but taking a well-defended hilltop was another matter entirely, especially if the defenders had stockpiled supplies and the attackers were operating far from their own bases. These were not castles in the European sense, permanent residences of lords and their retinues. They were communal refuges, places of last resort, activated in emergencies and left empty in peaceful times. Archaeological excavations at several sites have found evidence of intermittent occupation, fires that burned and then went cold for years, layers of refuse separated by layers of clean soil, suggesting periodic use rather than continuous habitation. They were, in essence, community insurance policies built of stone. And the fact that so many were built, across such a wide area, tells us something sobering about life in this region. War and raiding were frequent enough that nearly every community needed such a refuge. Surveying the Fortress Mountains. Theodor Schwindt, in his 1879 journey through the Lake Ladoga region, encountered linnavooret constantly. The density of these fortifications amazed him. Nearly every sizable community had at least one fortress mountain, often with visible remains of stone walls. Many had several. He catalogued them meticulously in his notes, recording names, locations, descriptions of the surviving stonework. Let us take a tour of some of the most significant, as he encountered them. Haminlahti's linnavuoret stood near the village of Haminlahti, overlooking the approach to Konnansaari Island where, tradition held, an ancient monastery had once stood. The fortress crowned a steep hill, and on its summit, still clearly visible in Schwindt's time, were the remains of stone walls. On the side facing Konnansaari, a wall stretched for 25 sills, about 50 meters, constructed of massive stones. On the opposite side, where the hill's slope was slightly less steep, another wall extended for 5 sills. Local tradition held that this fortress had been active when the monastery on Konnansaari was built, serving as a guard post and defensive position protecting the holy site. Harvey's Lapinlinna, the Lap's castle, was even more dramatic. Built on a high, sheer-sided rock outcropping at the neck of a peninsula, it completely cut off the peninsula from the mainland. The fortress walls here were constructed of stones so large that Schwindt described them as cubic ells, roughly a meter in each dimension. Such stones would weigh hundreds of kilograms. Moving them, shaping them, lifting them into place would require not just labor but engineering knowledge and coordinated effort. Local people told Schwindt that either the Metellelezit or the Lapps had built this fortress, the two explanations coexisting comfortably, suggesting that what mattered was not the precise identity of the builders but their antiquity and otherness. Mikkelin Linnanmäki guarded the shores of Kirkkalampi, Church Lake, with visible wall remains on the landward side while the lake-facing side required no walls, protected by sheer rock faces. Nearby, Kirkkamäki, Church Hill, rose on the opposite shore, and between them, tradition held, a great battle had been fought during the Swedish wars, with men shooting at each other across the water with both arrows and early firearms. On the island of Takalati, Schwindt found not one but 2 fortifications working in tandem. Linnasaari, Fortress Island, sat in the strait itself, its stone walls in places still standing 2 sills wide, extending for 100 sills around portions of the island's perimeter. On the nearby mainland, Linnanmäki rose to command the land approach. Together, they created a defensive system controlling both water and land routes. At Montsala, in the Sortavala archipelago, Schwindt encountered the Lapinlinna fortress, surrounded by a clear stone wall. At the base of the cliffside facing the water, he found the entrance to a large cave, Pakalaisen Luala, the refugees' cave, where, according to local tradition, people had hidden during the Swedish wars. The cave's entrance was so narrow and well concealed that from below, from boats on the water, it was nearly invisible. But from inside, the refugees could watch the waters and wait for danger to pass. Everywhere Schwindt traveled, Kurkijoki, Jakima, Sortavala, Impalati, he found these fortress mountains. Some were barely visible, their walls scattered by centuries of frost and vegetation. Others remained remarkably intact, their defensive purposes still obvious. In his final count, he catalogued dozens of sites, and he knew he was seeing only a fraction of what must have once existed. The Song of Stone. The song, Fortress Mountains, written by Libretto Orchestra based on these tales, captures something essential about these structures, their endurance and their silence. Upon every sacred hill, upon every mighty stone stand the fortress mountains where the ancients made their home. The fortresses are indeed found on sacred hills, not sacred in the sense of religious sites necessarily, but sacred in the sense of being set apart, special, recognized by the community as places of significance. The stones themselves become mighty not just through their size but through their purpose, transformed from mere geology into human meaning. Stone by stone they built them through the summer and the winter. This line captures the immense labor involved. Building these walls was not a project of weeks but of years, perhaps generations. Each stone had to be quarried or gathered, shaped if necessary, transported to the hilltop, often up steep slopes, and fitted into place. This required not just strong backs but knowledge: how to split stone, how to move weights beyond human strength using levers and rollers, how to construct walls that would remain stable through freeze-thaw cycles and the growth of tree roots. Fortress mountains, guardians of the past/built by hands long vanished, meant forever to last. Here is the paradox these structures embody: they were built to last forever, and in a sense they have. The stones remain. The walls, though fallen, can still be traced. But the people who built them, their names and languages and specific histories, are vanished utterly. The fortresses outlasted their builders by centuries, perhaps millennia. They guard a past they can no longer speak about directly. Every valley had its watchtower, every strait its guard/now the walls are crumbling, but the memories die hard. This is the state Schwint found them in, and the state they remain in today. Crumbling, yes, slowly returning to the landscape they were built from. But not gone. Not forgotten. The memories persist, even when they become uncertain, even when they transform into legends of giants and lapse and ancient peoples whose true nature is unclear. Who built the fortress mountains? This question fascinated Schwint, as it fascinates us today. Unfortunately, it is a question that has no single, simple answer. The fortresses around Lake Ladoga were not built all at once by a single people. They represent centuries, perhaps millennia, of fortification building by various cultures and peoples. Some may date to the Iron Age, constructed by Finnic or Sami peoples in the early centuries AD. Others are clearly medieval, built during the Swedish Novgorodian conflicts of the 13th to 15th centuries. Some may have been built, abandoned, and then refortified by different peoples at different times. Archaeological investigation of several sites has revealed complex histories. At some fortresses, multiple phases of construction are visible: earlier walls of simpler construction overlaid or replaced by later walls of more sophisticated design. Artifacts found at the site span wide time ranges, suggesting long periods of intermittent use. What we can say with confidence is this: the fortress mountains represent the Lake Ladoga region's deep history of settlement and conflict. Whoever lived here, in whatever era, faced the need to defend themselves. And the hilltops, commanding views and offering natural defensive advantages, were the obvious places to build. The folk memory that attributed these fortresses to the Metallelazit or the Lapps was not entirely wrong. Some of the fortresses probably were built by peoples, perhaps Sami, perhaps other Finnic groups, who preceded the Karelian settlement of the region. From the perspective of medieval Karelians, these earlier peoples were others, different in language and culture, their specific identities blurred by time. Calling them Lapps or giants was a way of acknowledging both their otherness and their impressive works. But many of the fortresses were certainly built by the ancestors of the very people who told Schwint about them. The fortress mountains were not just ancient mysteries, they were part of living memory, places their grandfathers had actually used, sites of battles they could date to specific wars. This layering of memory is itself revealing. The fortresses accumulated meanings across time. The same hilltop might be simultaneously where the giants built their fortress, and where we hid during the Swedish invasion of 1580, and where my grandfather stored grain during the famine. All these meanings were true, in different registers. The fortresses held multiple pasts at once. The architecture of defense. Look closely at the construction of these walls, and you can read in them the strategic thinking of their builders. Most fortress mountains share certain common features. They are built on hilltops with steep slopes on at least 3 sides, limiting the directions from which they can be approached. The walls are concentrated on the most accessible routes, blocking the easiest paths to the summit. Cliffs and sheer rock faces, where they exist naturally, are left unwalled. Why build what nature has already provided? The walls themselves typically consist of two faces of larger stones with smaller stones and earth fill between them. This construction method, essentially a primitive form of dry stone walling, has several advantages. It requires no mortar, which would be difficult to produce in quantity and would crack in freeze-thaw cycles. It can be built by people with relatively simple tools, stone hammers, levers, wooden rollers. And it drains well, allowing water to pass through rather than building up pressure that could collapse the wall. The height of the original walls is difficult to determine, as most have collapsed to some degree. But based on the volume of stone present and the thickness of the walls at their base, archaeologists estimate that many probably stood between 2 and 3 meters high, tall enough to provide cover for defenders and present a serious obstacle to attackers. Some fortresses show evidence of more sophisticated features. At several sites, archaeologists have identified what appear to be gate structures, places where the wall was deliberately left with an opening, but an opening that could be blocked quickly with timber or movable stones. These gates would often be placed not in straight sections of wall but at corners or angles, forcing anyone trying to enter to expose their unshielded side to defenders on the wall. A few sites show evidence of wooden palisades atop the stone walls, indicated by post holes cut into the rock or timber remains preserved in waterlogged sections. These would have increased the effective height of the fortifications considerably and provided platforms for defenders. The interiors of the fortresses varied. Some were simple open spaces, providing room for people and livestock during sieges. Others show evidence of structures, post holes suggesting wooden buildings, hearths indicating living spaces, storage pits for food and supplies. A few had wells or cisterns, solving the critical problem of water supply during a siege. What's striking, reviewing all this evidence, is how seriously these communities took defense. These fortifications represent enormous investments of labor, all dedicated to protection against a danger that might not come for years or even generations. But when it did come, when the raiders arrived or the army marched through, the fortress could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. Stories in stone, the fortresses in legend. The fortresses accumulated stories the way they accumulated stones, layer upon layer, across generations. At Kapalan-Jamaki, a wall nearly 150 sills long and 2 sills wide connected two sheer cliff faces, creating an impregnable barrier. In the cliffs themselves were natural caves, including one called Pakalaisen Luala, the refugees' cave, where people had hidden during the Swedish wars. The local tradition held specific memories. When the war came, we went to the fortress with everything we could carry. The caves held our treasures. The walls held the enemy back. At Sarolan Fortress, the folk memory was even more detailed. The fortress had protected the ancient church. You could still see the stone ruins of the church foundation, people told Schwint. When the Great War came and the Russians fled before the Swedes, the church bells were thrown into the nearby strait, with stones piled atop them to hide them until the rightful people could return. The fortress itself had been the site of a terrible battle. The war then, one old man told Schwint, was greater than any war in the New Testament times. This curious comparison, measuring historical wars against biblical scales, reveals how people without written records create frameworks for understanding the past. At Miklin, the fortress mountain and the nearby Kirkkomaki faced each other across the lake. Tradition held that during the Swedish wars, fighting had raged between these two positions, with men shooting arrows and firearms across the water. The lake itself became a battlefield, with boats trying to cross while defenders on both hills fired down upon them. The story may or may not be literally true, but it captures something real: the way these fortresses functioned as part of larger defensive networks, supporting each other, creating zones of control. Some fortresses had darker associations. At several sites, people spoke of the ground being cursed because of the blood spilled there. At Sakuraro, though this was a battlefield rather than a fortress proper, the earth was said to have drunk so much blood that nothing would grow there for 7 times 7 years, 49 years of barren ground as the land slowly forgot its trauma. Other fortresses had become places of mystery and treasure legends. The Virkasari fortress, some said, held the entire treasury of Kakasalmi Castle, buried when the fortress fell and never recovered. The Ristsari fortress had yielded, according to local memory, a huge chest full of coins taken by Russians several decades before Schwindt's visit, proof that there was something to these treasure stories, even if most searches proved fruitless. Fortress thinking, what the walls tell us. The density of fortifications around Lake Ladoga reveals something important about medieval life in this region. Insecurity was the norm. We often romanticize the past, imagining peaceful villages where everyone knew each other and threats came rarely. The fortress mountains tell a different story. They tell of communities that expected violence, that planned for it, that devoted substantial resources to protecting themselves against it. Consider what it means to build a fortress. You must organize labor, dozens or hundreds of people working together toward a common goal. You must have leadership capable of directing such efforts. You must have enough surplus food production to feed workers who are building rather than farming. You must have a shared sense of threat that makes the sacrifice worthwhile. The fortress mountains indicate that Lake Ladoga communities had all these things. They were organized, productive, and deeply aware of the dangers surrounding them. But there's another implication, darker: the fortresses were needed. The threat was real. Wars came. Raiders arrived. Villages burned. And the people who had not prepared, who had not built their fortress mountain or maintained their walls, were the ones who perished or were enslaved. The fortresses are monuments, yes, to human ingenuity and cooperation. But they are also monuments to human violence, to the endless cycle of raid and counter-raid, invasion and resistance, that characterized this borderland between empires. Guardians of memory. There is something profoundly moving about standing on a fortress mountain today. The people who built these walls are gone. Their languages, in many cases, have vanished. Their specific identities, whether they were Sami or Finnic peoples or early Karelians or some other group entirely, are lost to us. But their works remain. The stones that those vanished hands lifted still stand, still mark the hilltops, still command the views they were placed to command. In some strange sense, the fortresses have outlasted everything else. The villages below are gone, either abandoned after the wars of the 20th century or rebuilt in forms their original inhabitants would not recognize. The churches have been destroyed. The cemeteries are overgrown. The songs and stories and daily practices, all lost. But the stones remain. Silent. Patient. Waiting. They are guardians, as the song says, but guardians of what? They no longer guard people, those people are gone. They guard something else now, memory itself. The memory that people lived here, struggled here, defended what was precious to them. The memory that this landscape was shaped by human will and human fear and human hope. As long as the stones stand, we can look at them and know, someone was here. Someone cared enough about this place to move these massive rocks, to build these walls, to create something meant to last forever. And it did last. Not in the way the builders hoped. Their specific communities did not endure, their cultures were overwhelmed by larger forces. But the stones endure, and through them, we can still touch, however faintly, the people who placed them. That is what fortress mountains offer us, a connection, across vast gulfs of time and cultural difference, to other humans who faced their own struggles, made their own choices about what to defend and how to survive. The walls are crumbling, yes. But the memories die hard.